At the present time, we are most analytical. And looking around us in society, we are likely to be over-influenced by surfaces and fail to recognize that beneath these surfaces, the large, deep stream of human value flows comparatively undisturbed. Just as the individual may be perturbed by some incident that occurs, yet after the passing of this incident returns to his own more normal standard of values. The same is true with the world. And perhaps there is nothing, no subject, that gives us greater insight into the values which man holds to be important and real than the folklore or fairy tale or legend. First of all, these legends and fables, stories, are of great antiquity. They do not relate to the passing moods of times. They come up to us from a depth. Therefore, they give us a means of measuring depth. And this is of constant value and of continuous inspiration to us, because depth is always richer than we are inclined to suspect. As we go through the fairy tale and legend value in literature, we not only find the universality of certain essential plots, so that we can trace the plots of the Brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen back through nearly all of the cultural life of our race. We find that the primitive Egyptian, the ancient Chinese, the old Hindu, all of these peoples enriched their culture with mythological accounts, legends, and folklore. Not only do we therefore find this stream pouring out of antiquity, but we also observe man's instinctive and inevitable reaction to these stories. Actually, man will not preserve, sustain, or remember long that which he cannot associate with his own psychic life. If, therefore, he comes upon some account that is invalid as far as he is concerned, he will neither perpetuate it nor regard it with favor. From these basic points, it appears then that the continual affection that we bestow upon ancient legendary and the continuation that we have made of the essential formulas in modern literature, particularly fiction, these indicate our natural tendency. For example, in modern motion pictures, we know that all things being considered equal, the audience will require a happy ending. It will require some conclusion that is acceptable. And where we have a strong departure from this, we have a dramatic experiment which depends for its survival upon certain other values, which we will also mention. But all in all, the simple human formula is still the most successful in theater, in literature, and in motion picture and television. This again brings up the question, how did we gradually move from the familiar happy ending of past ages to the rather dismal realism which we like to feel represents the thinking of today? Perhaps the answer lies in a gradual motion in the last 50 to 100 years away from an essential pattern in the human psychic organism. For thousands of years, man has been subconsciously dependent upon religious inspiration. In emergency, the tremendous structure of the world's religious tradition comes to the assistance of the harassed or disturbed person. And during those long centuries in which our legendary and folklore developed, it developed in an atmosphere of essential devotion. The individual was primarily dependent upon spiritual value for his personal orientation. Spiritual value essentially stated the victory of good over evil, the victory of faith over fear, and that the virtues practiced in daily living must inevitably, in the end, have their due reward, whether in this world or in a better world beyond. Thus, essentially, through this whole long period of more than 5,000 years of recorded history, man's great refuge was his faith, was his sincere belief in the reality of a universal good, the reality of a benign, paternal, or parental force at the root of life. As the religious life of ancient man was considerably simpler than ours, there was very little creedal confusion. Until the Reformation, there was practically no general creedal confusion in Christendom that affected the life of the average person. There were various schisms within the body of the faith, but these were limited mostly to intellectual classes, minorities. The great body of religion moved serenely in the small town and in the village, where the people built their homes and gathered in the square facing the church. And here their lives were centered, polarized, around a strong concept of a benign world. Also, the average person at that time was not widely traveled, nor did he come in contact with intellectual stress. He lived simply, thought simply, and carried the daily burden of life. Therefore, your fairy tale, your story, your legend of this nature nearly always builds around simple things, average persons, everyday situations, dramatizing to a degree that which was familiar to all, and which each person could intimately associate with his own personal daily experience. There gradually arose against what we might term the romance literature of the medieval world the rise of what we like to think of today as the humanistic literature. Perhaps the most powerful instrument, from a literary standpoint, to point up man's disillusionment was the Spanish story by Cervantes of Don Quixote de la Mancha. Here we have this old knight living, dreaming, existing in a world of fable, discovering through a series of experiences that his dream world had no existence, that he was really a madman trying to restore a kind of life that had long departed from among us. After the story of Don Quixote, the increasing pressure of material things began to influence man's subconscious life. He began to develop the plot without the happy ending. And to the degree that religion in him was weakened by the pressure of externals, and he was subjected more and more to the pressures of material disillusionments, losing his simple, abiding, internal availability of faith, As this process gradually developed in society, we observed the definite change in the so-called romance story. We see the individual accepting more and more the tragic ending. He could not accept this and would not accept it did he not experience it. The tremendous pressures that developed after the Reformation in Europe, the 100 Years' War, all of these situations, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and finally the drift toward the scientific approach to life, these began to make inroads into the psychological life of the individual. We may say, however, that nearly all of these inroads, as the term suggests, constituted pressures from the outside. The individual, by nature an optimist, by nature addicted to idealism, began to experience more and more the physical frustration of his own ideals. He began to see or realize that he was living in a society which, as it involved greater complexity, began to lose its essential landmarks. Man was no longer able to observe around him the happy ending. He was no longer able to dominate the confusion of his environment. And this, of course, represents our state today, in which the individual becomes more and more of the conviction of his own helplessness, his inability to steer the ship of his own destiny, his increasing recognition, or at least assumption, that he is the victim of the world in which he lives. Thus, a new kind of realism imposes itself upon idealism. Idealism is pushed backward. Man still knows that it is essentially right. Man is still inwardly convinced that the way of good is the good way. Yet he is unable to demonstrate this through experiences in daily conduct. His neighbors are no longer friendly. He can no longer trust his associates. He wants to trust them, but he finds increasing difficulty. And most desperate of all, of course, he finds that he can no longer trust himself. He is no longer able to feel, as he retires for the night with simple prayer, that he has lived a good day, that he has done the things that he should do, that he has made some valid contribution to the happiness or security or well-being of those around him. These consolations, these natural rewards, are less and less obvious to him. Under such conditions, it is inevitable that conflict should arise in his own nature. And under the pressure of this conflict, that he should gradually take the attitude that the fairy story, the legend, and the good fable belong to children who have not as yet experienced the pressure of so-called maturity. Yet at the same time, whenever we dramatize or make a motion picture of some old fairy story, the adult audience is larger than the child audience. We all want to believe it. We all want to see good victorious. We want to see evil discomfited. We want to continue to live by the ancient code of our religion, namely, that in the end, before the power of good, all knees shall bow, and that sometime we shall have a golden age of peace and happiness upon the earth. These are our natural dreams, and these are still the dreams that most normally flow from our own preconscious state, or rise up from the unconscious background or underground of our living. Against this, we are building a strong intellectual pressure. This intellectual pressure of disillusionment essentially belongs to our mental life. It is our mental life that is no longer able to sustain our emotional life. And the average person today is under a heavy conflict between his mind and his instinct.